you're walking around selling them. So
We're going to go in front of Tom Johnson.
all right, I do want to hear.
Well, greetings on this November 7th, right? November 7th. Appreciate you coming out and having a discussion, as we're going to do today, about the whole issue of democratizing money. My name is Coleridge, and other folks here will introduce themselves. We're with the American Friends Service Committee and several other groups in town that over the past, several years have been interested in the whole issue area of money and power and the relationship between democracy and self-governance. And we thought it was very important as we talk about the occupation movement to try to make the connections between it and power. And certainly one of the most concentrated forms of power in our society has to do with those entities that create our money. When you think about it, there's two questions that arise when people think about money in our society. One is, what should it be backed up by, if anything? Should it be backed up by something like a precious metal, gold or silver, or should it not be backed up by anything? What's called fiat money, just backed up basically by the credibility and the legitimacy and the substance of the government that issues the money. And the second question is, should the creation of money be a public function or should it be a private function? Should it be something that the government does, we the people, or should it be something that entities like these, banks, do, financial institutions? So when you boil down the problem of money, it basically boils down, I think, to those two questions. And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the history of money for a couple minutes, and money creation, and sort of the tension that's existed over time between, the conflict between those two questions. And then going to be some examination of some of the problems currently of the current money system we have, and then what can be done, because there's something very tangible, very specific, namely a specific piece of legislation that has been introduced recently that we think can address the lack of democratic control of our monetary policy. So, money or monetary policy is basically nothing more than who controls both the issuance and the circulation of money. Historically, that was done by the sovereign, the kings and the queens of this world. That's basically what gave them so much power and so much sovereignty. Not just having the power to control armies and navies, but also the power to issue money and credit. But there was tension, because the money changers of centuries and generations ago wanted that power and tried to figure out how to acquire that power from kings and queens. And one of the ways they did that was through wars. And so wars were oftentimes fomented to make nation states and empires become dependent on the money changers and banks and people who had money. Because if you didn't have enough money in your empire's treasure, you had to go out, hat in hand or crown in hand, to try to acquire those funds necessary to wage war. And so the bankers and the money changers of centuries past would oftentimes get the European countries to fight against one another, because that became then a way for those empires to have to go out and get loans from these money changers, from these banks. And once you go out and get a loan, you, guess what, become dependent on those banks. So, and of course, those banks and those money changers become very profitable, because you're not only having to pay back the principal, but you're having to pay back the interest. And that's where wealth becomes incredibly concentrated. So the early history was oftentimes around trying to capture that power from sovereigns to shift that power and authority from them to banks and the like. So that's sort of what went on around the world. And in this country, of course, there was an epic struggle between people here who wanted to rule themselves versus being ruled by the sovereign king of England. And early on, one of the earliest examples of civil disobedience and earliest examples of the colonists trying to exert or flex their democratic muscles was by developing their own money. And they did that by literally creating money out of thin air. The state of Massachusetts was the very first, before it was a state, when it was a colony, created their own money system to facilitate transactions among the traders and businesses, because England was not providing enough silver-backed money in our society to facilitate economic transactions. Pennsylvania later on did the same, as did a number of other states. And when England, then, and the king passed a law, I think it was called the Coinage Law, making it illegal for the colonies to print their own state-based currency, Benjamin Franklin, among others, said that, among all the other reasons, that was maybe the central cause for the Revolutionary War. More than tax on tea, more than taxation without representation in other ways, more than other things. So that was the big issue that he felt was sort of a spark for the revolution. This led the colonies, when they formed what was called the Continental Congress, the very first act of the Continental Congress was to establish their own national currency, or among the colonies. And they called that currency Continentals. And they created $200 million of this local currency that was successful over 5.5 years to facilitate the economic transactions necessary to fund the war, to pay soldiers, to pay for the equipment, as well as to grease the economic wheels of the colonial economy. Sufficiently so to where this country, a ragtag bunch of Confederate soldiers, managed to fight off the most powerful military and economic powerful nation state on the planet at the time. And a big part of it was creating their own currency, again called Continentals. When the country became finally a nation state, again, you had this battle going on between those who wanted a public money system and those who wanted a private system. And early on, those who wanted to sort of mimic the British system and create a sort of federalist, and the federalists, in fact, were those who wanted to sort of take over the rule from the sovereign king and have the rule by a small number of people, led by Alexander Hamilton, began a process of creating 3 different national banks. And all of these banks were basically private banks, even though some of them were called National Banks of the United States, very misleading in name. First National Bank and Second National Bank. They were actually private banks controlled and where there were shareholders. 80 to 85% of them were shareholders of overseas, Dutch, English, and others. And in each case, these banks issued shares and created money, but not to do what we, the people at that time, thought were necessary to do, providing funds and the like. So the Congress managed to abolish or end the charter of both the First National Bank and then President Jackson, and the Second National Bank of the United States. And it was after that Second National Bank was abolished, their charter, that was the only time since basically our country's been formed in 1835 that we had 0 national debt. Because of course, when there was a national bank, you had to go out and you had to borrow money to fund whatever was necessary to be funded. And instead of issuing our own money as the Continentals, as the U.S. did, or the Continental Congress did, we went and borrowed money from this First National Bank and the Second National Bank and had to pay back the principal plus interest. And that was money, that interest, that couldn't be used for other things. Fast forward to the Civil War, when President Lincoln, in figuring out we had this massively expanding economy at the same time that there was this war that was beginning to be started, what can we do? He went to New York bankers, sought a loan from them. They were going to charge exorbitant interest rates. He said instead, you know what? We're going to create our own U.S.-based money. And those were called greenbacks because the money was printed, at least one of the side of it, in green ink. So the euphemistic term, greenbacks. $450 million of them was authorized to be printed, and there was no more than that actually printed. Same with Continentals. Only $200 million was authorized to be printed. Only $200 million was actually printed. So there was no more. There wasn't this spending spree, this lavish printing press spree. None of that took place, either in the Revolutionary times or during the Civil War. Continentals was used to fund the war, and again, that money was created debt-free. Continental, or the greenbacks, created debt-free. Those were in existence for basically 30, 40 years, or maybe 20, 30 years. And, the money changers, the big banks at the time, didn't like this. They were afraid. There would be this culture that would be created with people understanding, why is it that we can't create our own money?